The porcelain teacup flew across the room and shattered against the marble wall, exploding into white shards that skittered across the floor like scattered teeth. Inside the grand sitting room of the Park estate, time froze. No one screamed. No one flinched. No one dared to breathe. Eun-ji Moon stood at the center of the room, her fingers still suspended in the air from where she had released the cup, not in rage, but in deliberate, surgical calm. Her face carried no anger, no flush of temper, only stillness. The kind of stillness that is more dangerous than any scream. Her dark eyes swept slowly across the trembling staff, pausing just long enough on each face to remind them why silence was their only protection. "Pick it up," she said softly. Four servants lurched forward at once, nearly crashing into one another as they dropped to their knees. One young woman caught the edge of a shard against her palm. A thin red line bloomed instantly across her skin. She pressed her lips together and made no sound. She had learned. They had all learned. Eun-ji watched without expression. From across the room, seated in a black leather chair with his legs crossed and his posture perfectly relaxed, Ji-hoon Park observed everything in silence. He did not move. He did not intervene. He never did. His power had never needed to announce itself. It lived in the way the entire estate breathed around him, obedient and orbit-bound. And Eun-ji, his fiancée, had made herself a gravitational force all her own. The Park estate was known across the city for many things. Its fortress walls, its whispered reputation, and the quiet, damning fact that no one on its staff ever lasted long. People said the guards feared Eun-ji more than they feared Ji-hoon. With Ji-hoon, at least, the rules were clear. With Eun-ji, there were no rules. Only her. The call had come at 4:47 in the morning. Not from an agency. Not from a job board. From a private line that very few people in the world had access to, and the man on the other end had not introduced himself because he did not need to. Gabby Douglas had recognized the silence before he even spoke. The particular quality of it. Controlled. Expensive. The kind of silence that belonged to men who had never once in their lives been told no. "The Park estate," he had said. "We need an assessment." She had packed one bag. The city was still gray and half asleep when the car dropped her at the iron gates. No warmth in the light, no softness in the air, just the flat, cold weight of early morning pressing down on everything. The estate rose behind the gate like something that had not been built so much as imposed upon the landscape. Stone walls that did not invite. Windows that reflected rather than revealed. Security cameras positioned not to catch intruders, but to remind everyone already inside that they were being watched. A guard checked her credentials twice. Then a third time. He said nothing, but his eyes moved over her with the particular look she had come to recognize over the years. The look men gave a woman who arrived somewhere they did not expect her to survive. She smiled politely and waited. The head housekeeper met her at the side entrance. Her name was Mrs. Cho, a compact woman in her 60s with silver-threaded hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades absorbing tension on behalf of other people. She walked Gabby through the lower corridor quickly, her voice low and clipped, as though the walls themselves might be listening. They probably were. "You were referred by someone important," Mrs. Cho said. "That is the only reason you are here. I want you to understand that before anything else." "Understood," Gabby said. "People do not last in this house." She said it plainly, without drama, the way someone states the weather. Not because the work is hard. The work is manageable. They leave because of, she paused, choosing her word with the care of someone defusing something. Pressure. What kind of pressure? Mrs. Cho did not answer immediately. She stopped at a narrow window that overlooked the estate's east courtyard and folded her hands in front of her. Below, two groundsmen were raking gravel in the pre-dawn dark, their movements rigid and mechanical, like men performing a task they needed to finish before something woke up. "The kind," Mrs. Cho finally said, "that comes from one direction and has one source." She turned to look at Gabby directly for the first time. "You will know within the hour." The room they assigned her was small but immaculate. A single bed, a narrow wardrobe, a window facing the inner wall. No view. Intentional, Gabby noted. The staff quarters were designed to face inward, toward stone, rather than outward toward the grounds. A subtle architecture of containment. She set her bag down and took exactly 4 minutes to orient herself, cataloging exits, sight lines, and the sounds the building made when it thought no one was paying attention. Then she dressed and went to work. The morning briefing was held in the lower kitchen, and the moment Gabby stepped into the room, the conversation stopped. 7 staff members. All of them looked at her the way people look at someone standing too close to an open flame, not with cruelty, but with a helpless, private pity. A young woman near the back caught Gabby's eye and immediately looked away. Mrs. Cho assigned her the morning tea rounds, the linen rotation, and a detailed polish of the sitting room. The same sitting room, Gabby noticed, where fragments of white porcelain had been swept into a bin near the door, not yet emptied. The remnants of yesterday still sitting there, undisposed of. A reminder. Left deliberately, she suspected, so that no one forgot what the morning had cost them. She was lifting her tray when one of the older housekeepers touched her elbow. Lightly. Almost imperceptibly. "Don't look her in the eyes," the woman murmured, her gaze fixed on the middle distance. "Whatever you do, whatever she says to you, keep your eyes down." Gabby studied the woman's face for a moment. The tight jaw, the careful blankness, the fear that had been lived in so long it had become indistinguishable from calm. "Thank you," Gabby said quietly. She lifted the tray and walked toward the stairs. She did not look down. The sitting room smelled of white flowers and cold air. Gabby set the tray down on the low table with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that the way you entered a room told people everything they needed to know about whether you could be broken. Steady hands. Unhurried movement. She arranged the cups in the order Mrs. Cho had specified, green tea to the left, the small porcelain dish of sliced fruit to the right, and straightened up slowly, taking in the room as she did. It was a beautiful space, in the way that certain traps are beautiful. High ceilings, pale walls, morning light filtered through sheer curtains so that everything glowed with a softness that felt deliberately misleading. The furniture was expensive and arranged with the kind of precision that was less about comfort and more about control. Every chair positioned to face the center of the room, every surface clear of clutter, as though the space had been curated to ensure that whoever stood in the middle of it had nowhere to hide. She heard her before she saw her. Not footsteps. The floors were too well kept for that. It was the silence that changed first, the way the air in the corridor shifted a half-second before Eun-ji Moon appeared in the doorway. The 2 attendants flanking her moved like punctuation, present, but subordinate, their eyes already lowered before they had fully entered the room. Eun-ji herself moved slowly. There was no urgency in her, no performance of arrival. She wore ivory, her dark hair pulled back with architectural precision, and she carried herself with the total composure of a woman who had never once in her adult life been made to wait. She was beautiful in the specific, weaponized way of someone who had long understood that beauty, deployed correctly, was simply another form of dominance. She did not look at Gabby immediately. She crossed to the chair, sat, and lifted the green tea with both hands, examining its color against the light before she took a sip. One of the attendants adjusted a cushion without being asked. The other stood motionless, near the door. The whole choreography had the quality of something rehearsed into the body, a household that had learned to anticipate her needs before she voiced them, because the cost of being wrong was too high. Then she looked up. Her eyes found Gabby across the room and settled there with an easiness that was its own kind of threat. A long, unhurried appraisal, the kind meant to make its subject feel categorized. Assessed. Filed under something small. Gabby met her gaze and held it. The silence that followed was only 4 or 5 seconds long. In the sitting room of the Park estate, it was an eternity. Something moved across Eun-ji's face. Too fast to name. Too controlled to be certain of. She set her cup down with a soft, precise click. "You're new," she said. Her voice was low and even, carrying the particular register of a woman who never needed to raise it to be obeyed. "Yes," Gabby said. "What is your name?" "Gabby Douglas." Eun-ji tilted her head very slightly. You're looking at me, Gabby Douglas. Yes, Gabby said again. Another silence. One of the attendants near the door had stopped breathing. Gabby could feel the collective tension of everyone in the room pressing against her like a physical weight, the wordless, desperate plea of people who had already learned what happened when someone made this mistake and were now bracing for the consequence. Eun-ji smiled. It was a slow smile, unhurried and without warmth, the kind that appears on a face not because something is funny, but because something has been decided. Mrs. Cho told you to keep your eyes down, she said. Not a question. She did, Gabby said. And yet, Gabby agreed. The room held its breath. Eun-ji studied her for another long moment, her expression returning to that seamless, unreadable calm, the serene face of a woman recalculating rather than reacting. She lifted her teacup again, and the audience was, without announcement, over. You may go, she said softly. Leave the tray. Gabby set down the linen cloth, turned, and walked toward the door without haste. She felt Eun-ji's gaze on her back the entire way, not with anger, not yet, but with the focused, patient attention of a woman who had just identified something that needed to be dealt with. In the corridor, one of the junior housekeepers grabbed Gabby's wrist. What is wrong with you? She whispered, her eyes wide with something beyond fear. She doesn't forget. She doesn't let things go. She glanced toward the closed sitting room door. By tonight, she'll have already decided what she's going to do to you. The assignment came at noon, delivered by Mrs. Cho with the careful, neutral expression of someone conveying a sentence they had not written but were obligated to read aloud. The West Wing. All of it. By evening, Gabby stood at the entrance to the corridor and looked down its length with the quiet attention of a person assessing a problem rather than fearing one. The West Wing had not been used in months. She could tell from the quality of the stillness, the particular density of air in a space that had been sealed and ignored. Dust had settled into the grain of the hardwood floors. The tall windows were filmed with gray. Furniture sat beneath white sheets like shapes in a fog, and the whole corridor carried the cold, abandoned feel of a space that had been deliberately neglected so it could be deployed exactly like this. As a punishment. As an instrument. Mrs. Cho stood beside her with her hands clasped and her eyes forward. 13 rooms, she said quietly. Full clean. Floors, windows, surfaces, linens aired and reset. She has requested it be ready for inspection at 7. 7 hours. 13 rooms. Work that would take a full team 2 days. Will I have help? Gabby asked. Mrs. Cho's silence was its own answer. Gabby nodded once, collected the supply cart from the lower closet, and began. She worked without urgency and without panic, moving through each room with the methodical economy of someone who had learned to treat endurance, not as suffering, but as information. The physical demand was real. Her arms ached by the 3rd room, her knees by the 5th, but she had long ago trained herself to observe discomfort rather than be consumed by it. She noted it the way she noted everything. Cataloged it. Filed it away. The body was simply another variable in the environment. What she was really doing as she moved through those cold, shuttered rooms was reading the house. Every room told her something. The West Wing, she realized, had once been maintained with care, the kind of care that spoke of a household in order, a staff that had been allowed to take pride in its work. The neglect was recent. Intentional. She found evidence of it in small details that accumulating neglect could not entirely erase. A particular quality of furnishing, the arrangement of rooms, the way the space had been designed to receive guests rather than intimidate them. This wing had belonged to a different version of the Park estate. Before Eun-ji. By the 4th hour, 2 of the junior housekeepers appeared in the doorway of the room she was working in. They said nothing. They simply picked up cloths and began to clean alongside her, their movements quiet and deliberate. She did not acknowledge it effusively. She simply made space for them and kept working, and the 3 of them moved through the remaining rooms in a silence that felt less like absence and more like solidarity. She did not miss the risk they were taking. At 6:45, Gabby stood at the entrance of the West Wing corridor and looked down its length. Floors clean and gleaming. Windows clear. Every surface restored. The sheet-covered furniture had been uncovered, wiped down, and reset with a precision that made the rooms look inhabited rather than haunted. It looked, she thought, the way it must have looked before fear had been allowed to move in and redecorate. Eun-ji arrived at 7 with both attendants and Mrs. Cho trailing behind her. She walked the corridor slowly, her heels sharp against the restored hardwood, her eyes moving over every surface with the focused attention of someone hoping to find a flaw. She opened doors, ran a finger along a window ledge, lifted a linen corner, and examined the fold. The inspection took 11 minutes. When Eun-ji reached the end of the corridor and turned, her expression was composed and unreadable in that particular way Gabby had already begun to recognize, the recalculating stillness of a woman who had expected a different outcome. She looked at Gabby for a long moment. Then her gaze moved, almost imperceptibly, to the 2 junior housekeepers standing just behind her. Something shifted in Eun-ji's eyes. Not rage, something quieter and more deliberate than rage. She turned to Mrs. Cho. "Reassign them both to the laundry rotation," she said softly. "Night shift. Effective tomorrow." She walked away without another word, her attendants falling into step behind her, and the corridor returned to silence. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Before we continue, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and feel free to share your thoughts. Don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe. One of the housekeepers exhaled beside Gabby, a shaking, barely contained breath. "She can't touch you," she whispered. "So, she touched us instead." She turned to look at Gabby with eyes that held no accusation, only a quiet, exhausted truth. "That's how she works. That's always how she works." She paused. "And she's only just getting started." It was there when she opened her locker the following morning. A gold bracelet, coiled at the center of the shelf like something left behind by accident, except that nothing in the Park estate happened by accident. It was a delicate thing, fine-linked and deliberately feminine, with a small jade pendant hanging from the center clasp. Expensive. Recognizable. The kind of piece that belonged to someone who would notice it missing and say so loudly. Gabby looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then she closed the locker, left the supply room, and went to find Mrs. Cho. She located her in the East Corridor, overseeing the morning linen delivery with the focused efficiency of a woman who kept the household functional through sheer discipline. Gabby waited until the delivery staff had moved on before she spoke. "There is a gold bracelet in my locker," she said. "I need you to come and see it before I touch it." Mrs. Cho's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. A brief, recognizing flicker, like a woman who had seen this particular road before and knew exactly where it ended. She set down her clipboard and followed without a word. They stood together in the supply room, the locker open between them. Mrs. Cho studied the bracelet with her hands clasped behind her back, not touching it either. The silence held for a moment. "It belongs to Miss Eun-ji," Mrs. Cho said finally. Her voice was low and stripped of inflection. "She reported it missing this morning, 40 minutes ago." "Before my shift began," Gabby said. "Yes. And before I had opened this locker." Mrs. Cho looked at her then, a long, careful look that contained something Gabby read as both a warning and a form of respect. "She will ask for a search," she said. "Standard procedure when something of value goes missing. It will come to this room. It will come to this locker." "Then we should make sure the right people are present when it does," Gabby said. She did not wait for the search to come to her. That was the first thing she understood about traps, that the only way to dismantle one was to be standing outside it before it closed. She asked Mrs. Cho to summon the head of household security, a broad-shouldered man named Mr. Beck, who had the careful, watchful energy of someone who had survived a long time in a difficult house by staying scrupulously neutral. She asked him to bring the locker room's security log. The camera above the supply room entrance had recorded the door opening at 5:12 in the morning. Gabby's shift did not begin until 7. The log showed her keycard had not been used until 7:04. She laid it out in front of Mr. Beck and Mrs. Cho without drama, without accusation, without a single word directed at Eun-ji's name. She simply presented the sequence of facts in the order they had occurred, the way she would present any assessment, clearly, without embellishment, allowing the information to carry its own weight. "Someone entered this room before my shift," she said. "The bracelet was placed after that entry. I am asking that this be documented before any formal accusation is made." Mr. Beck looked at the log. He looked at the bracelet. He looked at Gabby with the measured expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of who, exactly, he was dealing with. "I'll document it," he said. The formal search proceeded an hour later, as Mrs. Cho had predicted. Eun-ji arrived with both attendance and the particular composure of a woman expecting a specific outcome. The locker was opened in her presence. The bracelet was retrieved, logged, and placed beside the security record, without ceremony. Eun-ji's eyes moved to Gabby's face the moment the log was presented. Gabby met her gaze with the same steady, unhurried attention she had offered since the first morning. No triumph in it, no defiance. Simply the calm, measured presence of a woman who had never needed the situation to be dramatic in order to be in control of it. The room was very quiet. Eun-ji looked at the log for a long moment. Then she lifted the bracelet from the table, clasped it onto her own wrist with practiced ease, and turned to leave without a word. But at the doorway she paused, just briefly, her back still to the room, and the pause itself was a message. A recalibration. The acknowledgement, wordless and controlled, that this particular move had not worked, which meant the next one would be something else entirely. That evening, Ji-hoon Park summoned Gabby to his private study. Ji-hoon Park's study was exactly what she had expected and nothing like it at the same time. She had anticipated the control, the spare, deliberate arrangement of a man who did not tolerate disorder, the desk positioned to face the door, the single lamp casting light in a precise radius that left the room's edges in shadow. What she had not anticipated was the quiet. Not the enforced quiet of the sitting room, performative and weighted with threat, but something genuine. The stillness of a space that belonged to a person who actually thought in silence rather than simply demanding it from others. Ji-hoon was standing at the window when she entered, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. He did not turn immediately. She stood and waited, and the waiting did not discomfort her. When he did turn, he studied her with dark, level eyes that reminded her of deep water, the kind that revealed nothing of its depth from the surface. "The bracelet," he said, "was placed in my locker at 5:12 this morning," she said. "My shift began at 7. The security log confirms both." A pause. "I know," he said. "Beck brought it to me." She said nothing. Ji-hoon moved to his desk and sat, lacing his fingers together with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once needed to fill silence with noise. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, not with hostility, but with the calculating attention of someone for whom people were, ultimately, variables to be correctly understood. "You didn't come to me directly," he said. "It wasn't necessary," she said. The facts were sufficient. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. He studied her for another moment, then nodded once, a small, decided gesture. "You may go," he said. She turned to leave. "Douglas." His voice stopped her at the door. She looked back. "Be careful tomorrow," he said. Not as a warning, as a statement of fact, delivered by a man who knew exactly what tomorrow was going to bring and had chosen, for reasons of his own, not to prevent it. She understood then that whatever Eun-ji had planned, Ji-hoon already knew, and he was going to let it happen. The formal breakfast was held in the main dining room at 9, a weekly ritual during which the senior household staff served the family's inner circle, a performative arrangement Gabby had gathered, designed less for the food and more for the architecture of status it allowed Eun-ji to inhabit. She presided at the table with the ease of a woman in her element, dressed in pale green, her posture impeccable, her voice carrying that particular musical register she deployed when she had an audience she wished to impress. There were 6 guests. Associates of Ji-hoon's, the kind of men whose suits cost more than most people's monthly salary and whose eyes moved over a room the way predators move over territory, assessing, categorizing, measuring threat. They watched Eun-ji with the cautious approval of men who understood power in all its forms, including the domestic kind. Gabby was serving the far end of the table when Eun-ji's voice cut cleanly across the room. "Stop." The word landed like a dropped blade. Every person at the table stilled. Gabby set the coffee pot down and turned. Eun-ji was looking at her from the head of the table, her expression composed, almost pleasant. Her fingers rested lightly on the tablecloth. "Come here," she said softly. Gabby crossed the room and stopped at a respectful distance from the table's head. She held Eun-ji's gaze and waited. "Kneel," Eun-ji said. The dining room went absolutely silent. One of the guests shifted in his chair. Another set down his fork with a quiet, careful click. Ji-hoon sat at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable, his posture unchanged. "No," Gabby said. The word was quiet, unhurried, and completely without apology. It landed in the silence of that room and simply stayed there, solid and irremovable, the way truth tends to be. Eun-ji rose from her chair in one fluid movement and crossed the distance between them before the room had time to react. The slap came open-handed and sharp, cracking through the silence like a gunshot, snapping Gabby's head to one side. The force of it rang through the room, through the bodies of every person in it, through the held breath of every staff member standing at the walls. A beat of absolute stillness followed. Then Gabby slowly turned her head back. Her cheek burned. Her eyes were clear, level, and utterly unmoved, fixed on Eun-ji's face with the same steady attention she had offered from the very first morning. And in the silence that followed, every person in that room understood that something had just shifted in a way that could not be undone. Ji-hoon's jaw tightened. He set down his glass. And for the first time since Gabby had arrived at the Park estate, he spoke in a room where Eun-ji had just acted. "Enough," he said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Enough. Ji-hoon did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The single word carried the particular weight of a man who spent it carefully, which meant that when he finally deployed it, everyone within earshot understood that something fundamental had changed. The guests at the table became very still. The staff at the walls became invisible, in the way that people make themselves invisible when they sense they are witnessing something they will be expected to forget. Eun-ji turned to look at him. For a fraction of a second, so brief that only someone trained to watch for it would have caught it, something uncertain moved across her face. Then the composure returned, smooth and immediate, like a surface sealing over. She refused a direct instruction. Eun-ji said, her voice controlled and even. In front of guests. "I saw what happened," Ji-hoon said. He had not moved from his chair. His hands were still laced together on the table, his posture unchanged, but something in his stillness had shifted quality. It was no longer the passive stillness of a man observing. It was the contained stillness of a man who had made a decision. "Leave the room, Eun-ji." The silence that followed was exquisite in its danger. Eun-ji held his gaze for 3 full seconds, long enough to be a statement, not long enough to be a war, and then she set her napkin on the table with a precise, unhurried movement, rose, and walked from the room with her chin lifted and her attendants falling into step behind her like punctuation after a sentence that had not ended the way she intended. The door closed. Ji-hoon looked at his guests with the composed ease of a man who had not just exposed a fracture in his household before 6 of his associates, but had simply made a minor administrative correction. "Forgive the interruption," he said, and lifted his coffee, and the breakfast resumed with the slightly over-careful quality of people pretending they had not just seen what they had seen. Gabby returned to the wall and resumed her post. Her cheek still burned. She did not touch it. What happened next occurred in the incremental, undramatic way that real shifts tend to occur, not in a single moment, but across the hours that followed, accumulating like water finding a new level. It began in the kitchen, where the staff had gathered after the breakfast service, and where the silence that greeted Gabby's arrival was a different quality of silence than she had walked into on her first morning. Not the silence of people bracing. The silence of people recalibrating. The head cook, a woman named Mrs. Yun who had not once directly addressed Gabby since her arrival, set a bowl of rice and braised vegetables in front of her without being asked. She said nothing. She simply set it down and returned to her station, and the gesture carried more weight than most speeches Gabby had sat through in her career. By afternoon, 2 more housekeepers had materialized beside her during the linen rotation without instruction, working alongside her with the quiet, deliberate solidarity of people who had decided, without announcement, which side of something they were on. A young man on the ground staff made eye contact with her in the corridor and gave her a small, definitive nod, the kind of nod that means I see you, not I pity you. She absorbed each of these things without performance. No warmth deployed strategically, no speeches made. She simply continued to work with the same steady, unhurried competence she had brought to every task since her first morning, and the staff responded to it the way people always respond to genuine steadiness, with a trust they hadn't realized they'd been waiting to extend to someone. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Before we continue, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and feel free to share your thoughts. Don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe. But Gabby was not without concern. She had worked in enough high-stakes environments to know that a public rebuke did not neutralize a threat, it concentrated it. Eun-ji had been humiliated in front of Ji-hoon's associates, and humiliated people with power and no accountability were the most dangerous variable in any environment. The trap had failed. The public confrontation had failed, which meant Eun-ji was now operating from a place of genuine desperation, and desperate people did not de-escalate. They gambled. That evening, passing the corridor outside Eun-ji's private rooms, Gabby heard 2 voices through the door, Eun-ji's low and controlled, and another she did not immediately recognize. She paused for only a moment, long enough to catch 4 words before she moved on. The dinner, Eun-ji said. Thursday. Thursday was 2 days away. Gabby spent both of them working and watching, moving through the estate with the same composed efficiency she had maintained since her first morning, but with a layer of attention beneath the routine that had sharpened considerably since those 4 words through the door. She noted the caterers who arrived Wednesday afternoon and were escorted to the kitchen by one of Eun-ji's personal attendants rather than Mrs. Cho, a deviation from standard protocol that Mrs. Cho herself noted with a controlled, tight-lipped silence that said everything. She noted the seating chart that appeared on the dining room table Thursday morning, 12 places arranged in a configuration that put Gabby's service station directly beside the head of the table. Eun-ji's place. Not an accident. A stage direction. She was still studying the chart when Ji-hoon's voice came from the doorway behind her. My study. Now. It was not a question. She set the chart down and followed. The study was the same spare, lamp-lit room it had been on her first visit, but the quality of Ji-hoon's stillness when she entered was different this time. He was seated behind his desk, and in front of him, open, was a file. She recognized it before she could see its contents, the particular weight of a folder that contained more than employment records, the kind assembled by people who knew how to look in places most employers never thought to check. He let her see that he had it. Then he looked up. Sit down, he said. She sat. He did not open with the file. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment with those deep, level eyes, and she understood that whatever he was about to say had been considered carefully before she walked into the room. You handled the bracelet situation like someone who has done it before, he said. Not the theft. The exposure. The documentation. The way you neutralized it without making it a confrontation. He paused. That is not a skill maids develop. Gabby said nothing. The West Wing, he continued. 13 rooms, 1 person, 7 hours. Mrs. Cho told me you approached it like a logistics problem. He tilted his head slightly. Also, not a skill maids develop. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not the testing silence of their first meeting, but the direct, negotiating silence of 2 people who had decided to stop performing for each other. Who sent you? He asked. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, a mutual acquaintance who believes your household has become a liability. Something shifted in Ji-hoon's expression, not surprise, exactly, but the particular quality of a man having a suspicion confirmed that he had hoped would not be. He looked down at the file, turned a single page, and read in silence for a moment before looking back up. Behavioral stabilization, he said. Damage control for high-risk households. Threat assessment and containment. He closed the file. You've done this for 4 other principals in the last 3 years. All of them in environments where instability had begun to compromise operations. He paused. None of them knew you were there in this capacity until you chose to tell them. That's correct, she said. And your assessment of my household? Gabby was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, but selecting, the way she always did when precision mattered more than speed. Your estate operates at a deficit, she said. The staff is functional but compromised. Fear-based compliance produces surface order and structural fragility. The loyalty you believe you have is conditional on a threat remaining credible. She kept her voice even and clean of judgment. The moment the threat source is removed or discredited, the entire system requires rebuilding from the foundation. Ji-hoon was very still. The threat source, he said slowly, being Eun-ji. Being the environment she has created, Gabby said. Which you have permitted. The word permitted landed with the quiet precision of something dropped from a height. She watched it reach him, watched the controlled, almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes that told her it had found the place she had aimed for. A man who prided himself on control, being told that the chaos in his house existed because he had allowed it to. He did not deflect it. She noted that. Filed it away as something important about who he actually was beneath the performance of power. Thursday's dinner, he said after a moment. I know about it, she said. His eyes sharpened. How much? Enough, she said, and watched something cross his face that she had not seen there before. Not quite alarm, but the close, considering attention of a man realizing that the most important person in his house for the last week had not been who he thought. He leaned forward slowly. What is she planning to do? Gabby did not answer his question that night. Not because she was withholding, but because what Eun-ji was planning was less important than what Ji-hoon chose to do about it, and a man who had been told the truth about his own house needed time to sit with it before he could act from it cleanly. She had learned that over years of this work, the most dangerous moment in any intervention was not the confrontation itself, but the space just before it, when the principal was still deciding whether clarity was worth the cost of what it would require them to give up. She left him with the file, the silence, and the question she had placed inside him like a seed. Thursday came cold and deliberate. The dining room had been transformed with the particular, calculated elegance that Eun-ji deployed when she needed a room to perform status on her behalf. White flowers, low candlelight, a table set with the estate's finest service, 12 places, 12 guests, each one a carefully selected representative of Ji-hoon's inner network. Men who financed things. Men who moved things. Men whose opinion of Ji-hoon's household was not merely social but operational, the kind of assessment that traveled back to boardrooms and back-channel conversations and shaped the invisible architecture of alliances. Eun-ji had chosen her audience with precision. Gabby worked the room from the service wall, her movements steady and economical, her attention distributed across the table with the practiced comprehensiveness of someone who had learned to watch everything while appearing to watch nothing. She noted the arrangement, how Eun-ji had placed the most influential guests closest to her own seat, creating a gravitational center around herself rather than Ji-hoon. She noted the particular smile Eun-ji wore as the guests arrived, warm and orchestrated, the performance of a woman in total command of her environment. She noted the moment, 40 minutes into the dinner, when Eun-ji's eyes found her across the room and stayed there. It began quietly, as Eun-ji's moves always began. Douglas. Her voice carried cleanly across the table conversation, and the room did what rooms always did when Eun-ji spoke with that particular register. It lowered its own volume instinctively, creating space for whatever was coming. Pour Mr. Shin's wine. Gabby crossed to Mr. Shin's place and poured with steady hands. Now kneel and apologize to him, Eun-ji said, for the delay. There was no delay. The wine had been poured within 30 seconds of the glass being empty. Every person at the table knew there was no delay. That was, of course, entirely the point. The table went quiet. Not the organic quiet of a conversation pausing, but the held, collective stillness of 12 people understanding that they were no longer at a dinner, but at a demonstration. Eun-ji sat with her hands folded and her expression serene, her eyes on Gabby with the patient, almost pleasurable attention of a woman who had been waiting 4 days to arrive at this moment. Gabby set the decanter down on the service table behind her. She turned to face the room. She did not kneel. She did not apologize. She simply stood with the same unhurried, grounded stillness she had carried through every room in the estate since the morning she arrived, and she waited. The silence stretched. And then Ji-hoon set his glass down. The sound of it, small, clean, precise, cut through the silence in a way that made several guests straighten involuntarily. He had not spoken. He had simply set his glass down, and the authority in that single gesture was total. He looked at Eun-ji from the other end of the table, and what passed between them in that look was not a conversation but a reckoning, the accumulated weight of everything the last week had revealed, delivered in a single held gaze between two people who understood each other completely. "Eun-ji," he said. His voice was quiet and absolute. "We're done." 2 words. No elaboration. No performance. In the particular language of power, it required none. Eun-ji's composure held for exactly 3 seconds. Then something beneath it cracked, not dramatically, not with tears or rage, but in the small, terrible way that real things break. A tremor at the corner of her mouth. A single blink too many. The seams of the performance showing through where the performance had finally run out of structure to hold itself together. She rose from the table without a word, and this time there was no lifted chin, no choreographed attendance, no parting gesture of control. She simply left, and the room exhaled around her absence, like a body releasing a long-held breath. Ji-hoon looked across the table at his guests with the composed authority of a man who had just made a decision that would cost him considerably, and had made it anyway. "Forgive the interruption," he said, as he had once before. But this time, no one pretended it was minor. And across the room, standing at the service wall, Gabby felt something she rarely permitted herself in the middle of an assignment. Not triumph. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something quieter and more honest than either of those. The particular, private recognition that something broken had just been set back on its foundation, and that the setting had been worth every cost it had taken to arrive here. She picked up the decanter and continued serving, because the work was not finished yet. It never was. But somewhere beneath the professional composure, in the part of her that she kept carefully insulated from the work, something had shifted. She had entered this estate as an observer, as an instrument of assessment. She had told herself, as she always told herself, that the distance was necessary. That belonging was a liability she could not afford. She looked at Mrs. Yeon refilling the bread basket with quiet dignity. At the young housekeeper who had warned her on the first morning, now standing straighter at her post than Gabby had ever seen her stand. At Mr. Beck near the door, whose nod, when their eyes met, contained an entire conversation. She looked at all of them and felt the distance she had built, as she always built it, beginning quietly to cost her something. She packed the same bag she had arrived with. One bag, folded with the same economy she brought to everything, nothing added, nothing left behind. The room that had been assigned to her, the small one with the window facing stone, looked exactly as it had on her first morning. That was intentional. She had learned early in this work never to leave an impression on a space that she would then be required to take back. You came in clean. You left clean. The work itself was the only mark you were permitted to make. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment before she rose, which was something she rarely allowed herself. The pause before departure, the beat of stillness between what had been and what came next. In other houses, in other assignments, she had walked out without it. She had not needed it. The distance had always been intact and sufficient, and the leaving had simply been the final, administrative step in a completed process. This time the pause came anyway. She let it. Eun-ji had been removed from the estate before dawn. No announcement, no assembled staff, no theater. Simply a car at the side entrance, 2 of Ji-hoon's men, and a departure conducted in the efficient, quiet manner of a man who understood that the most decisive endings required no audience. Gabby had heard the car from her window and had sat in the dark for a moment, registering the sound of it fading down the drive. The estate had exhaled around it. She had felt that too, the particular, building-wide release of a household that had been holding its breath for a very long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. By morning, the atmosphere had changed in a way that was difficult to articulate precisely, but impossible to miss. Mrs. Eun had hummed something in the kitchen, briefly and without apparent self-consciousness, before catching herself. The young housekeeper had taken an extra moment arranging the entry flowers, not from anxiety, but from something that looked, tentatively, like pride. Small things. The kind of small things that only meant something if you understood what their absence had cost. Gabby understood. She carried her bag to the main corridor and found Mrs. Cho waiting. The older woman stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her posture as composed as ever, but her eyes held something that had not been there on the first morning, a directness, an openness, as though several carefully maintained interior doors had been quietly unlocked. "You could stay," Mrs. Cho said. Not as a plea, as a fact being offered for consideration. "My work here is finished," Gabby said. Mrs. Cho nodded once, slowly, accepting this with the grace of a woman who had long known the difference between what she wanted and what was true. She extended her hand, and when Gabby took it, the handshake held a moment longer than formality required. Ji-hoon was waiting in the entrance hall. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his posture carrying that familiar, self-contained stillness, but something in it had changed quality since the dinner. The performance of it had receded slightly. What remained was something more unguarded, which on a man like Ji-hoon was its own form of disclosure. He looked at her bag and then at her face, and said nothing for a moment. "Your assessment," he said finally. "The formal one. I'll receive it through the usual channel." "Within the week," she said. He nodded. Then, with the particular care of a man choosing words he was not accustomed to needing, "What you did here, the way you did it." He paused. "I've had people in this house my entire career. Fixers. Strategists. People I paid to solve problems." He looked at her with those level, considering eyes. "None of them did it the way you did." "I didn't fix your house," she said. "I showed you what it needed. You fixed it." Something shifted in his expression, the closest thing to genuine surprise she had seen on his face in the entire time she had been there. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he inclined his head in a gesture that was small and deliberate, and, from a man like Ji-hoon Park, the equivalent of a great deal more than it appeared. She walked through the entrance hall and out through the main doors, which had not been open for her on the morning she arrived. She noticed that. Filed it away, without ceremony. The morning was cold and clear, the drive stretching ahead of her between stone walls that no longer felt like containment. The car was waiting at the gate. She walked toward it without haste, without looking back, not from coldness, but because she had learned a long time ago that the work you left behind either stood on its own or it didn't, and looking back never changed which one it was going to be. She got into the car. The gate closed behind her. And in the estate at her back, in the kitchen where Mrs. Eun was humming again, in the corridor where the flowers had been arranged with something that looked like care, in the study where Ji-hoon Park was sitting with a blank sheet of paper in front of him and the particular expression of a man beginning to understand what accountability actually required, the work continued. Quietly, without her. The way it was always supposed to. If you've made it all the way to the end of this story, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for watching, for staying, for caring about Gabby and the people of the Park Estate the way you have. Drop a comment below and tell me what this story meant to you. And if you want more stories like this one, head over to Julia's Romance Library. There are more waiting for you there. Subscribe so you never miss a single one. These stories exist because you choose to listen, and I will never stop being grateful for that.